they're going to do what many of us thought was unthinkable only a couple of weeks ago, which is to actually break that manifesto commitment.
We had Rachel Reeves come with a very particular message. All of your taxes are going up. Everyone is going to be here. And it feels pretty much like she's going to rip off the plaster and go for income tax, which I think last week we suggested would be electoral suicide.
A massive, massive deal for the Chancellor to do this.
Pints and Prime Minister's questions sure beats work for a living. But we've got our noses back to the grindstone this week for an amazing episode of The State of It. And Mummy and Daddy are back. I'm Gabriel Pogrund.
I'm Patrick Maguire.
I'm Caroline Wheeler.
And I'm Stephen Swinford. In this week's edition, all roads lead to the budget now. That is the dominant conversation in Westminster. We come fresh from a pretty unusual Rachel Reeves press conference this morning. We'll talk about that. And we'll bring you some scoops on what could be in the budget and some of the decisions Rachel Reeves is making. And then we will come on to Keir Starmer and his leadership and some of the increasing concerns that MPs are expressing behind closed doors about the whole direction of the Starmer project. And essentially, will he survive? So let's kick off with the budget. We had Rachel Reeves do a pretty unusual press conference in the Treasury this morning. It was unusual because we're 3 weeks out from a budget and chancellors normally have a kind of total omerta. But instead, we had Rachel Reeves come with a very particular message for all of our listeners, which is essentially all of your taxes are going up. Everyone is going to be here. She said in this kind of Lord Kitchener style address, we all need to do our bit and to essentially pay more tax to shore up the public finances. And it feels pretty much like she's going to rip off the plaster and go for income tax, which I think last week we suggested would be electoral suicide.
Yeah, we did. And she'd be the first Chancellor to raise the basic rate of income tax since Dennis Healey in 1975. So it would be a massive, massive deal for the Chancellor to do this, particularly because she spent the whole election campaign saying she wouldn't touch it. After the budget last year, of course, she said, don't worry, guys, the last thing I'm going to do next year is come back for more taxes. And now that's the one thing she is making clear she's going to do, be it income tax or something else.
I think she characterised the last budget as a once in the Parliament type event. And I suppose what's so striking about the language today, to which you refer, Steve, is the fact that she is laying the ground for sweeping tax rises. I mean, we should say that, you know, what she didn't say was as conspicuous as what she did say. The reason it was such a idiosyncratic piece of oratory was that we were told she would say something and she didn't actually paint a picture of what the budget would say in its substance. But I think where the Treasury has found itself now is a kind of awkward position where, having made all these pronouncements about who Labour's losers are going to be, they've realised that jacking up the higher or additional rates of income tax just isn't going to get them where they need to go.
Today's speech was twofold, really. One was this new narrative about contribution, that everybody has to make a contribution, which, as Steve says, is very much about we're all in it together again.
National effort.
A national effort. And again, I think it's this pitch rolling. There's a real understanding now that not enough of this pitch rolling was done before the last budget. That got them into a whole heap of trouble, particularly around winter fuel allowance and obviously prior to the spring statement when we dealt with those welfare cuts, which is what ended them up in the situation with their backbenchers. So I think there's a real sense this time that they've got to lay some of that foundation a while out from the budget if, as it seems to look like, they're going to do what many of us thought was unthinkable only a couple of weeks ago, which is to actually break that manifesto commitment and actually do some kind of blanket tax-raising change.
Look, I'll take you inside the Treasury for a minute, but one of the things just briefly on that is I always find it just utterly surreal, the whole process around a budget. That why she stood up today, if you're going to raise taxes, just say you're going to raise taxes. You don't have to say explicitly which one, but instead we get involved in this weird Delphic game of semantics, which we sit here and have to decode. I've done countless budgets. I'm of the opinion, just get it out there. Start saying it. Why do we do everything on the day? Why is there an obsession with rabbits in the budget? The headlines are going to be about tax. So if you're going to roll the pitch, start rolling it more explicitly. I think there is a case for that. But look, what I wanted to talk to you about was that After this speech in the Treasury, she has gone back to her office and she is sitting with what are called the major measures on her desk. So they are the major tax, spend and growth policies.
And that's an early deadline, isn't it?
That's an early deadline. So the deadline for that is the next couple of days. So she finishes those. So the budget is essentially broadly going to be set in the next couple of days. They will be sent to the Office for Budget Responsibility. We've talked about it before. It's the fiscal watchdog, this tiny body that basically marks the government homework, says this will have that effect, this will raise that much money, your growth policy will do that. And it comes back next Monday and it basically passes judgment on all of her plans, and then we are in the end game. Essentially what it means is that the broad outlines of the budget are coming today. She is putting pen to paper, and that is why we've had this speech today. So until this moment, all things are possible, and there are lots of things on the table. After this moment, after those numbers go to the OBR, it's much less room for manoeuvre, and the kind of centre of the budget gets much more settled. That's where we are.
Isn't that one of the reasons why she's not being as explicit as maybe we would like, or maybe we wouldn't like it because we'd have less to write about? Our jobs would be much simpler, and maybe the podcast would be much shorter. But you mentioned the OBR, Steve, as we mentioned the OBR every week, as is tradition. There is actually quite a lot that's gone right for her in the past couple of weeks. The markets like what they're hearing. They had a great time in Washington at the IMF. I wrote in the Times a couple of weeks ago that here in Westminster, Reeves can't move for people telling her she's doing a bad job. She was feted by the Canadian finance minister saying, I know you guys over there hate the fiscal rules, but we love them so much we've just copied them. The managing director of the IMF was saying what a great job she was doing. The markets are responding positively to what she's saying on tax and spending restraint. The Resolution Foundation this morning saying the size of the black hole is only 14 billion. So it may well be, look, it's not going to be good, but it might be a sort of slightly lighter shade of bad than we were expecting. So she can't sound too gloomy. I mean, she's sounding very gloomy, but she has to strike a difficult balance between keeping the markets reasonably happy, which they have been relative to past performance, and also not spooking the public and damaging what is left of confidence in business and among consumers by saying your taxes are going to go up, as she has to appear on the 26th of November and say, actually, it's not quite as bad as we thought, but maybe that's wishful thinking.
Should we talk about some of the things that we think are in the budget then? So we talked about income tax, but it may not be a straightforward income tax hike. It may be what is being referred to by that think tank you referred to, the Resolution Foundation, as kind of 2 up, 2 down. So a 2p hike in income tax, which hits all people with income, including pensioners, and a 2p cut in national insurance for certainly some workers on lower earnings is one of the things that's being talked about in the Treasury.
Yeah, and we spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. The politics of that are not good, but they're better. It's closer to the letter and spirit of the Labour manifesto, i.e. we're not going to raise tax on working people. Now, of course, working people pay income tax, but Reeves could get up and say, look, I'm cutting the tax that is specifically levied on workers. National insurance is going down. So if you have a job and most of your income's from a job, then you probably are slightly better off, But again, it's a very, very difficult argument to make from a position of weakness.
Then you've got extending income tax thresholds. Now that will hit everyone. Currently, they are frozen until 2028. And there's a process called fiscal drag, whereby as people earn more money, more of their income gets taxed and they get dragged into higher rates of taxation. So that will continue. And then there's the kind of wealth taxes, the mansion tax, jacking up council tax for the kind of upper echelons of property values from 1991. That looks to be on the cards. And they also look to be going after kind of doctors, lawyers and other high earners with a tax rate on limited liability partnerships, which we spoke about the other week. So these are all around the edges. There is another discussion that we picked up in the Treasury, which I think I would gently say they would have to be incredibly brave to go for. But that discussion is a time-old discussion about what do you do about fuel duty. So under the Tories, there was a temporary cut in fuel duty, a 5p cut that was introduced. And this cost the government loads of money. It cost like 4 billion. And it's one of those temporary cuts which has become an almost permanent rolling feature of the tax system. It gets renewed every March. It comes in again. And everyone kind of keeps this fiction that it's a temporary measure. Well, actually, is it? There is a conversation in the Treasury about possibly unwinding this now, arguing that fuel prices are lower than they were when this came in, and then maybe it's time to come. The massive caveat I would put on that is it's a cost of living thing and it'll hurt people in their pockets. Do you really want to have a war on motorists? But I think the very fact they're having that discussion shows you how desperate things are.
Or even having the discussion about council tax is another one, which is really difficult. And certainly when I've talked to very senior members of the Treasury, they're very queasy about both of them, because they know that, for example, our sister paper, The Sun, will have a field day over fuel duty. They always do. It's very much seen as a tax on the white van man.
Yeah.
And similarly, as we know, with any changes to sort of council tax, home taxes, the kind of spectre of the poll tax kind of comes roaring in and people are very nervous. But look, she's clearly very limited in her options. One of the ones that we know that she will do something on is a gambling tax. But people that I've been talking to in the Treasury are actually saying that the figures around the gambling tax, it's been put as a levy that could raise as much as 3.2 billion, are really wide of the mark and actually are not going to raise anywhere near that amount, particularly now they seem to have ruled out including within that horse racing. But also some nervousness there as well, that any sort of tax could impact on pubs, for example, with the slot machines that actually in some instances prop up ailing pubs. And of course, bingo halls, which are very popular in some of those red wall seats, could also be impacted by that. And let's not forget as well that Flutter, which is a big betting site, is actually based in the Chancellor's constituency herself. So again, that's not an easy source of revenue for her. But of course, there are things that she wants to pay for as well. Let's not forget about that. It's not all about taking in revenue. And the big number that she'll be looking at very carefully is those billions that she would have to spend offsetting the 2 childcare cap if she were to go there. And now that's something that both Lucy Powell and of course Bridget Phillipson, who were in that deputy leadership race, both basically spoke very vocally about wanting to cut it. And of course, it was pretty powerful coming particularly from Bridget, because she sits on that child poverty task force. And the fact
she heads
that...
it, doesn't she?
Yeah. She basically heads it, and she's described the 2 childcare cap as being despicable, as being cruel. And so it really does put quite a lot of pressure on Rachel Reeves, alongside all those backbenchers that want to see that axed, to do something about it. But whenever I speak to people in the Treasury, they're very nervous again about completely axing it, because do just say carte blanche, you can pay for it for every single child that you have. And one senior figure said, what if somebody had 10 children? That would be £40,000 worth of benefits that are going. So there are definitely still very much live discussions about how far you go down that route. I mean, the sense that I get, and I don't know what you're hearing, Steve, is that they absolutely are not going to go for the full fat option. They see that as being really unaffordable.
They can't afford it. The gambling tax doesn't raise enough money, so they won't do it. And that is a political problem, because all of these MPs on the left and people like Bridget Phillipson are very vocal in saying you have to do this. And Lucy Powell has already used her brief start as deputy leader to kind of go for Starmer on this and go for the kind of values argument. There will be a backlash if she doesn't do this, and how they make that argument is going to be critical.
Yeah, I think when you think about the politics of this budget, I mean, there are essentially 3... I hesitate to use the word stakeholder because that makes me sound like a junior Treasury minister. So I say 3 audiences that she has to bring on side. She's got the Parliamentary Labour Party, she's got the public, and she's got the markets. And what they all need to hear are not one and the same. I spoke to a friend of hers last week who said that her own thinking had evolved. If you wind your mind back to last year, her language was that she discovered this black hole and her hands had been tied. She essentially said she had no choice other than to give effect to the reforms that she did on winter fuel, only to U-turn on them. And this person said that her language and thinking has evolved from I have no choices to, well, these are my choices. Her own sense, it seems, is that the public are more reconciled to the idea of tax rises than one might think. I think what she wants to do is, well, the way she actually embarked upon the process of writing the budget was at the very outset, she said she didn't want to see the spreadsheet. She's sometimes pilloried for being spreadsheet Rachel. In this instance, she said, well, let me get my core priorities set in stone first. And in terms of what those are, she's talking a lot now about the NHS. She's saying she's going to build a castle around that. Caroline's alluded to the fact that she's desperate to do something on cost of living and bills. And I think that she will attempt to do something on child poverty, as you outlined, but not the whole hog. And that is sort of her attempt to square the circle and say, well, this is infused with Labour values. We're also hearing about the possibility of a bigger surcharge on large banks. So they're going to say, we have, to the extent that we can, gone after the people that you expect a Labour government to go after. We have, to the extent that we can, even if not in the full fat way you might like, address the issue of child poverty. But here are the tough decisions. That is a sort of rhetorical, political journey that she's hoping to take her party on. I think, by the way, she does think that her party is possibly the least signed up to this mission. I think the market she regards as being sort of, if not safe as houses, and pretty much behind her. I think she regards the public as being ambivalent, but it's Labour MPs who seem to be the trickiest constituency for her.
If that's her reading, I would say she's got it almost 180 degrees wrong, because I'd say, actually, what's the easiest thing you can sell to Labour MPs? It's, we're going to raise taxes to fund the stuff you like. And why did Lucy Powell get on the ballot for deputy leadership in the first place? Because this government spent ages not raising taxes, because it did spending cuts to the winter fuel allowance and to welfare instead. Indeed, couldn't do the welfare cuts because MPs were so angry. It's true that if you say to the markets, look, we're going to raise taxes, the markets will say, okay, good, because your sums add up. I think, to return to what you said about fuel duty, Steve, the public may not know yet what is going to happen. They may not have read the Labour manifesto, but we had a long conversation with someone who was involved in the politics, in drawing up the politics of and selling the last budget fairly recently, Gabriel. And they were telling us about, the run-up to the last budget. People were so fatalistic about it. They were reacting really strongly negatively, even before it had happened, because they heard so much about potential tax rises, they thought they'd already happened. But the idea that the public, if, for instance, their fuel duty goes up by 5p, and as was the case in Tony Blair's first term, when did William Hague briefly lead in the polls? It was during the fuel protest. It was when there were tankers not delivering fuel. It was the politics of fuel are always really fraught, especially making people pay more for it. So the idea that the public are going to say, yeah, you know what, fair enough, tax my commute to a greater extent than you have been, is the least tricky part of all of this for Rachel Reeves. Is I think naive if her thinking is the PLP are tricky to square. No, I think, if you say we're going to raise taxes and wealthy people are paying more, a critical mass of them, the sort of people who nominate Lucy Powell, will say, great, tax the rich, that's what we're in politics to do. I think the public could react very, very strongly negatively against this.
Well, look, we're going to have a brief interval shortly. If you want to hear more, we've got an event coming up, the Times and Sunday Times, the day after the budget. Patrick, I, Fraser Nelson at the Times and others will be sitting down, Maureen Carl, our economics editor, to talk about the budget, what's in it, what the politics, and what does it mean for Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer. Crucially, the question of, does Keir Starmer survive, which is quite timely because that's what we're going to be discussing after the interval. And you can get tickets at thetimes.co.uk/events. We'd like to just move on to the issue of Keir Starmer and the kind of existential crisis facing his own leadership. Now, last night, Keir Starmer went to address the PLP, as it's called, the Parliamentary Labour Party. And this is something that, as journalists, we've all done for many years. You go down to this committee corridor, which is one of the longest corridors I've ever seen. And outside a committee room 13, I think it was last night, all the journalists huddle while the Prime Minister is inside addressing Labour MPs. And the Labour MPs can ask him anything, and we're all kind of straining at the door, trying to hear what is said. And then
you hear the banging of the tables.
And afterwards, you get a parade of cabinet ministers coming out, whether it's Tory or Labour, and they all tell you how brilliant the Prime Minister was. And that's what happened last night. They said he was terrific. He had the room behind him. It was all great. But after that, you get the kind of MPs emerging, and they talk to you in the corridors, as they've done for centuries, MPs in the corridors, and they say, it wasn't quite like that. So last night's event, the PM was asked 24 questions, and the atmosphere in the room was, I think it's accurate to describe, as pretty grumpy. He got some really difficult questions over the budget, over ECHR, over Farage and reform, and people are not happy. And one person said to my colleague, Aubrey Allegretti, my great colleague, this guy just doesn't have a clue. It was a kind of robotic, standard Starmer speech, low energy, And I don't know where we're going. And that's the question. Where are we going?
I had a similar bit of correspondence yesterday from an MP. They couldn't believe how dependent Starmer was on his notes. I mean, we're in this moment in our political life where you feel you need fire and passion and clarity and argument. And Starmer, this person told me, was weirdly beholden to, I'm not sure if it was a piece of paper or an iPad, but the material in front of him. We are in this weird holding pattern now in Westminster where the notion of Starmer not being long for this world has become far more widespread than it was even a month ago. I think just a combination of, this summer of misfortune, of resignations, of scandal, of ambiguity about the budget has just deepened the existing sense within the Parliamentary Labour Party that he doesn't have what it takes to arrest the ascent of reform.
Or the Greens now as well.
Or indeed the Greens. That's definitely, especially for Labour MPs who are much more mindful to what's going on the wider left. There is a sense that the walls are closing in on the party demographically and electorally. And we are in this holding pattern now ahead of the locals in May, that the notion that there might be a challenge, or the notion that the Labour Party will have to think seriously about whether that is what it wants. It has a sort of unstoppable force at the moment.
I picked up something about that too, is that even the whips now are talking about May, which is pretty unusual to actually get whips talking about a potential leadership challenge. They're pretty much there to stop them from happening. But a Labour MP told me the other day that one of the whips has been talking to them and said that they thought that they could hold back a leadership challenge if Sir Keir Starmer managed to keep the sort of percentage of voting to 27% at the local elections, which at the moment is looking like a pretty tall order when they're looking at sort of 19% of the vote.
If not him, who? I guess is the question. Patrick, do you want to have a shot?
Well, look, I think...
Sorry for the hospital pass.
A friend of the podcast, or at least a listener to the podcast, I know, Wes Streeting, the health secretary, is attracting attention with the way he's speaking right now, which is he is speaking very assertively about progressive values, about standing up to Nigel Farage and reform, and he is looking left, which is a shrewd move if, like Wes Streeting, you are considered by colleagues to have impeccable Blairite chops, as he does. But, he has a point to prove. Listen to his conference speech. There's a moment where he, after paying tribute to Angela Rayner, basically says, and our friends in the GMB and Unison, let's give them all a round of applause because I'm so proud we've got a unionised health sector and people sticking up for workers. So Wes Streeting is playing what you call in the trade a cute game. Obviously, Shabana Mahmood, and she very pointedly did not deny that she had leadership ambitions, is very well regarded by much of the PLP. Is she ready? And that's a question some people are asking. Home Office is the graveyard of ministerial ambitions usually. I think that's another phrase Shabana Mahmood used to me. Those would be the two people are speaking about most. Obviously, Angela Rayner we would have spoken about, but it's probably not feasible that she comes back. Other dark horses, Louise Haigh, the former Transport Secretary, again, a significant figure on the soft left of the Labour Party, and like Wes Streeting, is firmly rooted there. Lots of people speak of her as ambitious, left the cabinet in very...
and angry. She's angry.
Yeah, indeed. One of the people Number 10 had to go cap in hand to quell the welfare revolt. So, it's clear that she has deep roots in the bit of the PLP that you would need to get 80 MPs onto the ballot. But look, it's sort of wide open, and for that reason, it's difficult. It's very rare you hear someone say the answer is this person.
Yeah.
And that is the problem for the Labour Party in Parliament, because if they had an easy answer to this question, we'd probably see it settled soon. It probably would have been settled by now. I remember one Friday night in September, just before Labour conference, I got a phone call from a senior Labour official, the sort of person who's in and out of Number 10 a lot. So I took this call and we had this amazingly discursive conversation. They said, look, can I imagine a world in which if things continue at their current rate, that we get a letter from front benchers this side of Christmas after the budget saying it's time for a change of leadership? That's the mechanism that forced Tony Blair, of course, to say this is when I'm going, when Tom Watson did that as a junior minister in 2006. They said, can I see that happening? Look, people are so angry, it maybe could. But the problem is you don't pull the trigger unless you know what's going to happen in the days, hours, weeks afterwards. And I don't think anybody does. That's the problem.
I spoke to one minister earlier who was saying that they thought, I suppose as in comedy, that in politics timing is everything, and the timing of the leadership contest, whenever that does come to pass, is going to be decisive. You think about Wes Streeting's brief, his job is to reduce the waiting list. If he does that, he's got a very straightforward story he can tell to the Parliamentary Labour Party and to the Labour membership at large, which is, I've future-proofed our beloved NHS, Labour's great creation. Don't think of me just as a Blairite. I've restored and put on a long-term footing the one thing that every progressive politician can agree about. I think Shabana Mahmood's predicament is slightly more complicated in that at the moment, in terms of her language and the letter of her policy, she's taking the Labour Party and this government to places that it doesn't ordinarily go. Language about indefinite leave to remain on small boats. She's doing things that Labour politicians don't do. That's why, by the way, she has so many advocates within the party who respect her for being able to tell a story that Starmer himself, for instance, can't tell, and has, on the occasions he's sought to do so, he's ended up disavowing his own words. And yeah, that does require her to sort of lean into languages and ideas that don't ordinarily endear one to the Labour Party. Whereas if you have this contest later on in the Parliament, in the event that she has materially changed the situation on small boats, her sell becomes radically different, which is, I'm the person that removed migration from the body politic. I dealt with it. I'm the Farage buster in chief. Whereas at the moment, I think her sell is slightly different. And I do also hear that question about, well, is she ready? I mean, I think that her own story, and certainly the story told by many of her allies, is that her path to the top was forestalled by Starmer, who didn't appreciate the role that she played in saving the party from Corbyn. She was belatedly brought in as Shadow Justice Secretary, but I think there was a perception from many people that her talents weren't amply recognised. But it has meant that her introduction to the party and the public was more belated than that of Streeting, who does have the vibes and energy of being slightly more ready-made a candidate, and that is what he'll need to be if there is an early contest after the locals.
The only issue with both of those two candidates, and I think we're probably all agreed that both Shabana Mahmood and Wes Streeting look the most likely to throw their hats into a ring, partly because what Shabana said to Patrick not so long ago, but they're not creatures of the soft left. And if you don't have an Andy Burnham figure, there isn't a kind of obvious soft left candidate, apart from one person we haven't talked about. And whisper it, because I can scarcely believe it myself. There is still mutterings about Ed Miliband coming back. Yep. And, you know, what I was told by a pretty senior Labour insider was that he has been buoyed by the deputy leadership contest and seeing the result for Lucy Powell, who obviously is seen to be much more on the left than Bridget Phillipson was. And so, I mean, it's possible that he may also see this as an opportunistic moment to return to the fore. And let's not forget that polling amongst Labour members, his name often comes up top.
One possible underestimated quality is Keir Starmer's character, which I just wanted to touch on briefly. He is pretty tough. There are, if I look at successive Tory prime ministers under extreme pressure when their leadership, things get really ugly. You get Boris Johnson sitting there, the cabinet falling around him, and he's obsessing over the snake, Michael Gove, and the betrayal, and it gets very emotional and they lash out. I'm not getting those readings about Starmer. He seems pretty level. He seems, you know, just going through it. And it is that kind of Terminator quality of just somehow being able to resist this enormous pressure that he's under, which could actually hold him in good stead for what is to come.
But isn't it also the fact that MPs actually quite like Starmer on a kind of personal basis? I mean, he's not somebody that, you know, is seen to be particularly divisive. You know, the number of people that I've had a conversation with, often, Patrick, quite often late on a Friday night, where they've said, you know, on the one hand, we've got to get rid of this individual because he's going to lose us the next election. But on the other hand, they're saying, but I really do quite like him on a personal level. He's a decent guy. He's got good values. But at the same time, they think he's pretty useless at politics.
Yeah, I remember Andrew Adonis, the Labour peer, the morning after Hartlepool by-election, got in touch with me and said, I've written a piece about Keir Starmer for the Times. And there was a line in it. He basically said, Keir Starmer's never going to win an election and he's a complete clown. But there was a line in it that said, you know, we've learned that Keir Starmer is a perfectly decent man and a good human rights lawyer, but he lacks the skills and political antennae to operate at the highest level. And I think actually that's basically what most MPs would say. Perfectly nice guy if you can get in front of him, which He's got a new political secretary, Amy Richards, who's trying very hard to get him in front of people. And, that's endearing him to people to an extent as a man. But where are the political antennae? And that's where the flip side of the Terminator characterization, I think, Steve, is that's all very well and good if you're going to be vindicated by events. And I don't think you can look at the polling and look at the budget and say, oh, it's all great because Keir Starmer's going to grit his teeth and Keir and Morgan are going to be proved right again. I mean, do you want Keir Starmer to be, looking into the middle distance and striding silently towards oblivion? I don't necessarily think you do. Labour won 11% of the vote in Caerphilly. 11% of the vote in the South Wales valleys in a seat it's held for the entirety of its existence. I mean, that's not good. I mean, that's not something you want a leader to be oblivious to. It's all very well and good saying, oh, Keir Starmer doesn't respond to pressure. Keir Starmer doesn't feel the pressure. It's like, actually, now would be quite a good time to start feeling the pressure and start recognising the pressure the Labour Party is under. So, yeah, perfectly decent guy, rubbery resilience is the phrase Andrew Marr once used. I mean, that's fine. But ultimately, it's pretty bad. And, it requires someone to wake up and show the passion and not, as you said, Gabriel, be looking down at a piece of paper every other word for what you meant to say when the Labour Party is in an existential crisis. And I don't think it's putting it too strongly to say it is.
When you think about the challenge that Starmer faces, I think his biggest asset is the lack of clarity about not who could replace him, but what would replace him intellectually and politically. Whether it's Wes or Shabana, they will very quickly be asked, well, what is it in terms of macroeconomic policy, fiscal policy, social policy? What's the big distinction between you and the government of which you are until the present day part of? And I suppose what I wonder is whether the PLP en masse is of the view that even if his replacement wasn't substantively different from him in terms of the politics and policy, whether just having somebody else would naturally be an improvement because of the fact that he is mud in the eyes of the public, his polling numbers are so subterranean, and because he's not a political animal, so simply doesn't feel the pressure in the way that he ought to. I spoke to an MP yesterday and asked, we're talking a bit more about the politics ahead of the budget and what Labour MPs had been on the receiving end of. And this person said, well, I'm sure there'll be lots of charming engagement. The problem is that Starmer's not very charming and he doesn't do very much engagement. MPs are emotional beings. And I think a lot of them would say, yeah, it would be better to have somebody who stylistically, aesthetically was anything other than Starmer, even if the underlying sort of new Labourish politics remain more or less the same.
Yeah, not being hated by the public is a good start.
It is a good start.
Well, it's probably going to get much harder before or if it gets better. So that brings us to the end of this week's podcast. We'll be back obviously next week when discussions around the budget will be entering the end game in the run up to November the 26th. And look, we want to hear from you. So if you want to email us, get in touch with questions about the budget, politicians, their characters, their flaws, anything you want, email us at thestateofit@thetimes.co.uk.
Lastly, and most importantly, thanks to our wonderful producers, Molly Guinness and Euan Dawtrey.